pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Rina Bliss, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy. So
I would be honored.
So because Associate Professor of Sociology, the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University. She also has, I believe, still affiliation with UCSF as well as Berkeley. She is the author of many influential and impactful books. I will mention them now. Rethinking Intelligence, which was published with HarperCollins. It's a previous book. Before that, there was Social by Nature, and our first book was What's Real About Rest? Untangling.
That's the current one, yeah.
The first one was called, a second. Rest Decoded, the Genomic Side for Social Justice. The current book is What's Real About Rest? Untangling Science, Genetics, and Society. Her books have actually won several prizes or several mentions in the news. These books actually was one of Nature's Best Science Speak of 2025. Was quite an achievement. Nature being one of the two preeminent journals in sciences. Our 2023 book on Rethinking Intelligence was a notable book of behavioral scientists. So many of her books have got a lot of attention. She has published also the best journal in sociology, American Sociological Review, and so on and so forth. You can imagine I won't go through the whole CV for you. We're extremely pleased to be able to listen to her. Once over, we have 6 lectures. Some of you don't come here very often. We have 6 ALS lectures, and one of the ALS lectures is meant to somewhat to reach out to a slightly broader audience. And this year, we are delighted that Rina accepted to give that lecture. We think it's important for Center for Philosophy of Science to not only talk to philosophers of science, but also try to reach out to the broader academic community, but also the broader community of people in Pittsburgh. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you all for coming. So yes, I'm Dr. Rina Bliss. I would love you to call me Rina. And I'm a genetics expert and a sociologist. I'm also an author and a researcher and a professor at Rutgers University, as Edward said. And my work is on health and illness. And I have a focus on the relationship between genes and environments in the research that I do. And I'm also a mom of 3, and they're little. So I'm really honored to be here today to discuss a subject that has been on my mind for a very long time, and in my research and in my writing for well over a decade, almost 2 decades. And that is the persistent and troubling links that we make between race and intelligence and ability. As rapid scientific advancements in genomics and now artificial intelligence continue to reshape our understandings of the human experience, these old prejudices keep on reemerging. And they do so, and they resurface in these very insidious ways. And we find ourselves re-asking very dangerous questions about whether intelligence is encoded in our DNA, whether our racial identity determines our cognitive abilities, and whether algorithms can possibly predict our potential and our abilities and our social outcomes and our behavior based on our genetics. These aren't abstract academic debates. They are things that have real world consequences, real life consequences. The way that we think about race and intelligence determines who has access to opportunities, who's considered deserving of resources, and ultimately who thrives in our society versus who struggles and suffers. That's why I wrote my latest book, What's Real About Race, which was released just last year. And I have some paperback copies that I'll, sign for you, share with you after this talk. And in this 4th book of mine, I challenged the deep-seated myths that continue to shape our institutions and our policies and even our own research. This book explores how race, though not genetic, remains one of the most powerful forces shaping our world today. It traces how racial categories emerged, how they've been reinforced through scientific and technological achievements and advancements, and also how they continue to shape our institutions in ways that often go unnoticed. It also asks these critical questions like, how do we move beyond racial determinism in the sphere of genetic research and science? And how do we move beyond genetic determinism when we talk about race? How do we ensure AI and genomic science don't just replicate all the mistakes from the past? And most importantly, how can we rethink race in ways that lead to a greater understanding of what it really is and greater equity and, not just deeper divisions? So this book is a product of both my personal journey and my academic research. My interest in race didn't start in a lab or a classroom. It really started in my childhood. I grew up in an immigrant community in Los Angeles, and my mom is an immigrant from Indonesia, and she came to this country for opportunity for a better life, for education. And while she was living in LA, she met my dad, who himself had come from New York with his Ashkenazi Jewish family. And inside our home, we enjoyed this kind of unique tapestry of Bahasa, meets Yiddish kind of language and culture. But outside our home, it was a completely different story. LA is, of course, a very diverse city. It's got a rich multicultural history and present, but I was still made to feel that at the core of my being, the strange mixture that I was somehow wrong. And this happened most often for me at school, where I began to be bullied for the way that I looked. In elementary school, I took on all of these experiences, and I began to form a clear sense of what race was. And I figured that out from what my teachers were saying, what other students were saying, and in a more subliminal way from, pop culture and things that were going on in my community. And I learned that you were born into a race, and it was somehow in your blood, in your DNA. We didn't talk about DNA specifically, but it was like something that you inherited from your parents, who acquired it from their parents, and on and on. And there was no way of escaping the race that you were. And as I moved on to middle and then high school, I found that there was even more stereotyping and a lot of outright racism. All of the kind of things I had experienced as a younger kid continued. And now I saw how, I had friends who were even being kind of mistreated by our teachers. So there was a lot of racism that I was, living and breathing. And what I learned in secondary school was how to effectively code switch. So I would don various racial roles for different performances depending on the venue, the audience. So in the classroom, I would mark the box for Pacific Islander, as I was told back then I was supposed to do, which is funny because today I would not be told to do that, but back then that's what I was told to do on the standardized tests, on any kind of like forms, right? But on the playground, and especially in the presence of fellow like dark-skinned friends, I would shift to this kind of general person of color role. So race was requiring this constant performance. I understood that different races were supposed to talk differently, act differently, be destined for a certain kind of future, for certain kind of jobs. You could see it in like your friends and what friends you had and what neighborhood you lived in, who your parents were, what their friends were like, and what their jobs were like. And all of this to me was like, you had to basically do your best within those constraints. But something shifted when I went to college. All of a sudden, I had access to this new way of thinking, to professors who were researching race and looking at it from a critical standpoint. And they started to really challenge my own understanding of race. in the late 1990s, what my professors were finding was this. In America and around the world, we use a kind of DNA definition of race to justify everything from, stereotypes and mistreatment, prejudices, and all of that bias was extending to what we thought of our inherent value as human beings to be, right? And for my professors, race, wasn't just some kind of mistake. It wasn't an innocent mistake. It was a set of lies that did and still do justify heinous mistreatment of humans, things like colonization, enslavement, and genocide. So race was a fiction that literally killed. What I began to study and research alongside these professors of mine was race as a social construct. Our understanding of race as a social construct reaches back generations, but this critical analysis that I was now privy to at my university challenged our misunderstanding of race as a genetic construct for the first time. And this was just some 20 odd years ago. And it was in the summer of 2000 that leaders of the Human Genome Project revealed the initial findings of the global mapping effort. And that project, which took more than a decade to complete, of course, proved that humans were 99.9% the same. Our DNA, no matter what we look like on the outside, is almost exactly alike. And with the data from this project and new insights from the social sciences and anthropology and philosophy of science and history of biology, and all these people stood together and agreed that race was something that was created from human interaction and not just your biology, not just your genes. And the expression race is a social construct became a useful catchphrase for people who are trying to break apart that notion of race being just genetics, right? To differentiate race and DNA. So I explored this concept more deeply in my first book, Race Decoded, which is this book over here. So while researching and writing this book, I really spent time with the geneticists who were doing that mapping, the Human Genome Project and other, big project leaders, these people who are working in the field. And I was looking to understand what they were finding in their research and what kind of conclusions they were coming to draw, what we were learning about DNA. And what I ultimately found in that research was reinforcing this message that the Human Genome Project shared with us some years back. And it's what scientists repeatedly told me, which is that when it comes to conversations about race and our genes, we need to actually get rid of race from that conversation about what genes really are telling us, right? And so there are no such things as markers of our DNA or alleles or genetic variants that can tell you, like, this is your race, right? And so it's not helpful to use racial terms in genetics. And yet many of these very scientist reports and studies published in highly respected journals seem to say otherwise. So genomic research findings often presented outcomes according to racial or quasi-racial categories, continental population origins. And that was not because the researchers themselves honestly believed that it was the most beneficial way to represent the populations that they were studying, or to structure their research, but because the major national funding organizations like the NIH or National Institutes of Health required them to tabulate race. And that led to recruitment by race in studies. Or maybe they used a already racialized data set like HapMap phase 1, later the 1,000 genomes data set, 23andMe, that was a big one. Or they were tasked with using a racial or quasi-racial reporting taxonomy from the journal that they were publishing in. And these funding bodies and global genome projects and scientific journals prioritize the inclusion of racial representation in scientific research as a way to promote equity. This necessitated the incorporation of racial qualifiers somewhere in the research process, right? So consequently, geneticists found themselves compelled to frame their work within these very problematic taxonomies and categories, right? So they really were using these easily misconstrued terms despite the fact that they didn't really believe in them. These policies and structural reorderings, which had intentions of promoting inclusivity, of course, number one priority, and addressing disparities, also a big priority for public health in scientific research, in genomics, as it was becoming something that was being hoping to translate from bench to bedside, right? They were inadvertently perpetuating the social constructs of race that we already had that were doing us harm and reinforcing existing biases. And they have continued to do so in the contemporary moment. So by compelling researchers to frame their investigations within racial categories, these gatekeepers were inadvertently endorsing and perpetuating the erroneous notion of inherent racial differences at the level of DNA. And scientific publications, which serve as not just gatekeepers, but also repositories of knowledge and inform public discourse, they became unwitting accomplices in disseminating and legitimizing racial stereotypes. So as I watched these misconceptions of genetic research permeate our national conversation, I struggled with the concept of at its heart, really, like, how could some of the top geneticists in the world, really, not just the country, but the world, tell me one thing, that race was not a part of their research and should not be used in the same conversation, you know, as talking about genetics, and shouldn't be considered part of their work at all, and then publish another, right? How could that happen? So my internal struggle with the contradictions within the scientific community led me to look deeper. And I started to look at what became my second book, Social by Nature, a book that took me more deeply into the social constructs and societal understandings of race and human nature and ability. So beyond the geneticists and the biologists that I had been studying, I began to speak to social scientists who were trying to analyze the diversity of people's abilities and social behaviors in terms of genetics. So a field that my collaborator, Jean Robinson, called sociogenomics. And in the last decade, there have been many experts researching intelligence, education, economics, and crime, and other kinds of, you know, social phenomena, who have conducted genomic studies in which they survey a person's genome and calculate a risk score. The score attempts to predict how intelligent they will be or how far they might get in school, and, you know, what financial decisions they might make, what kind of, you know, retirement investments they might carry out, right? Things like that. And or whether they'll be aggressive, violent, whether they'll be promiscuous, sexually promiscuous, perform acts of rape, things like that, okay? And so they were looking for genes associated with how at risk people would be to enact certain behaviors. Despite claiming to be anti-racist in their work in general and agnostic about race in particular studies, very few studies actually sampled DNA from people of non-European descent anyways, I found these researchers still used highly racialized bodies of data, like IQ averages, school statistics, and crime and sex rates. They did this to build their algorithms. And they conduct their studies on many of the same racially classified DNA data sets that feed much of genomic research. So 23andMe's data set, UK Biobank, all of many different studies and data sets. But in sociogenomics, while many people claim that their findings and risk scores pertain to just Europeans or just Asians or just Africans as genetic populations and not to the social groups we call races, their studies are inherently structured by race and lend themselves to racial comparisons and interpretations. And as many of you know, in May of 2022, after citing a study, a sociogenomic study on educational attainment in a manifesto that was posted to Google and to Discord, Peyton Gendron live streamed himself killing 10 and wounding 3 other Black shoppers at a Tops Friendly market in Buffalo, New York. So he had misinterpreted study findings to say that races had different intellectual aptitudes. The problems here are layered and the outcomes are incredibly dangerous. As a professor, but also as a parent, the impacts on our education means everything to me. And the education system is always at the front of my mind. So let's explore an example of how these findings might play out in this area of research in the field of education where we all are right now. So these risk scores have been used to describe a policy framework designed to resonate with liberals who want to reinvest in our public school systems. And the framework suggests policymakers and public school administrators and teachers basically take a student's genomic data and identify at-risk students to rescue them with special programs or special, put them in special classrooms, or to provide them with specific interventions that can help them. So far from giving up on the academic needs of children, people who, or, college students or anyone in their education who might be predisposed to so-called low IQ or low intelligence, or low educational attainment, if you could say that, based on this assessment of their genes, this policy would help give people extra academic tutoring or, give them, access to special education or something like that in areas and subject areas where they are supposedly, according to their genes, going to need the most help. So every student could thrive if they're provided the education that meets the needs of their unique DNA. That's so-called the right education for them, or so they say. Sounds good, right? An individualized education for every person in America, for every child. Well, the first problem comes when we take a step back and recognize that the focus on so-called genomic disadvantage, and this is the language that people are using right now, diverts our attention away from the true problem, which is that racism plagues our education system. And I experienced this in my own education, and maybe you did too, or maybe you witnessed it at least. And, proponents of these genetically tailored schools cover up the mountains of research that prove that IQ tests and school environments are racially biased, and that racial inequalities are confounding the data that they've collected and the algorithms that they've built. And then we layer emerging technologies on top of structural racism. And in almost every aspect of our lives, we're trying to figure out what are the implications of AI, what's artificial intelligence going to mean for ourselves, for our family members, for our careers, for industries and everything. And with these new advancements, we could take a genetic risk score. This is the one that sociogenomics scientists have been saying they want to use for generate for every student in America and feed them into a language model under the guise of finding the best possible outcome for an individual student. Right now, that framework is being argued for people of European descent only, according to the scientists who have conceived of it. But if this is adopted by public education systems, then there will be a demand for tests and frameworks for other racial groups too. So consider the system for your own child or a young person that you're close to, that you care about. So AI is giving your child these risk scores and plugging your child into an educational program that provides for them, but at the same time limits them. And again, eventually this could be explicitly racialized. So this data has already determined what they're capable of in their lifetime without any human intervention, without a caring teacher, somebody who knows what they're really going through, what's happening to them. What are those environmental and societal challenges that this child is facing, and may very well overcome. A computer tells us what our children can and cannot be. A computer tells us we can or cannot attain in our lives based on these scores. So what we'd be doing with policies based on this research is creating groups of haves and have-nots solely based on their genes, genetic haves and genetic have-nots. Human intelligence and how far we get in school and whether we're antisocial or labeled as antisocial and whether we are labeled as needing policing, for example, according to the researchers who ascribe to these notions, is just about genetic luck. Some people win the genomic jackpot and others lose it. So we're saying that a person's genetic makeup and possibly their racial one too predetermines their abilities, and even more than that, their choices in life, their outcomes. You can't get a PhD because your genes said so. In an altruistic version of these events, we'd intervene. And so instead of getting a PhD, at least we'd help people keep people out of prison or whatever their DNA says they're supposed to be doing. But imagine a nightmarish version of this educational structure where students are sorted into special needs programs or even schools based on their race. Or an even more terrifying version where students of color are given non-academic training while white kids are shuttled off to elite colleges. We could even see the emergence of separate school systems for students sorted by intelligence and a return to the kind of separate but unequal education that existed in the past. Of course, these nightmarish scenarios have historical precedents in this very country, and it's these precedents that can become blueprints for something much, much more dangerous. You see, these findings dovetail with powerfully racist doctrines of white supremacy that I've written about in my recent book, Rethinking Intelligence. Doctrines that maintain that it's not inequalities by race and class that drive educational outcomes, it's innate genetics. The notion of racial risk scores in education systems demonstrates, in its most extreme form, a dangerous form of eugenics. One in which purportedly race-free science, like remember the scientists say, we don't do race, we're not doing that, we're not touching that, could encode institutionalized genocide against people who are categorized as low IQ. Because if the only marker of genetic failure or genetic loser status is a low IQ score, it would only be a matter of time before those with lower scores are incorporated into the system as losers who need to be edited out of our society or designed out of our society. I know it seems like extreme or hyperbolic what I'm saying, but white supremacists' erroneous assertions of intellectual superiority and intellectual inferiority of marginalized groups underscores the imperative for a nuanced reckoning with the scientific research and its interpretation within these broader social contexts. It becomes crucial for us to exercise caution when drawing connections between race and genetics. All of it has to be contextualized within the framework of a society that is rife with systemic racism. We must acknowledge that the social structures that are shaping individuals' lived experiences is something that is systemic, and that environmental influences are driving what's going on with people and their societal outcomes. So our utilization of technology often reflects a very disconcerting trend in which advancements or discoveries are consistently channeled into pre-existing systems of inequality. So we've seen this in terms of AI with racist algorithm biases, but there are many other examples where, despite the potential for technology to catalyze progress and foster inclusivity, we watch as instead the implementation perpetuates and amplifies existing disparities. In recent years, genetic selection and embryo choice piqued my interest in this intersection of technology and perceived abilities and institutionalized racism manifesting in racially stratified databases. Through technologies like CRISPR, we now have this unprecedented ability to edit genes, a technology I thought would mean the end to certain debilitating conditions. In the beginning, we heard CRISPR was going to help us end blood diseases that are very painful and require blood transfusions over a lifetime. And, that's what the cures were going to be about. And yet over the past few years, I've watched as instead these advances have been first used to select for enhancements and preferred physical attributes or mental abilities. And they become a way for people with financial means to choose the sex of their babies. That was like one of the first major uses. And then not long after the choice of your baby's sex came the notion of editing in cognitive advantages. Companies in my own home state of New Jersey, not far from where I'm raising my kids, started marketing the ability to help select embryos for higher intelligence. And it shocked me. In fact, today there are a number of companies that are pairing AI and sociogenomics to select for IQ. And I'll tell you more about this in just a moment. But this paradoxical phenomenon where innovations with the potential to save lives and significantly enhance countless lives are instead employed to perpetuate systems that inflict harm underscores the fundamental flaw that we see in our approach to innovation. The failure to critically examine the underlying structures and the power dynamics in which technological developments are situated. And as new technologies emerge and novel sciences unveil groundbreaking findings that are meant to improve our lives, their integration into these existing societal frameworks reinforces and exacerbates entrenched patterns of discrimination and marginalization. History shows that our first impulse has been to leverage new tools and technology to manifest old prejudices around gender, race, intelligence, ability, and on and on. And as people offer services to evaluate these embryos for higher intelligence and use genetic tests or AI to determine the outcomes most likely for our children and in ourselves as well, because there are all kinds of things being marketed to people, to grown-ups as well, we stand at the edge of a slippery slope that has always resulted in ethically questionable and morally repugnant outcomes, rooted in the enduring myth of racial hierarchies of ability that can be overcome through genetic selection. So, as you can see throughout my academic journey in higher education and in my own research, I set out to answer the difficult question that I felt like there was still so much to learn about. And that is the central contradiction that became the focus of my latest book, If race isn't genetic, then why does it feel so real? If race is a social construct, then what's real about race? So what's real about race is my attempt to untangle that contradiction. Within this book, I explore how science has both reinforced and debunked racial myths, how genetics is often misunderstood, and how race remains one of the most powerful social realities in our world today. And to understand where we are today, we have to look at the history of how race has been viewed in our country and around the world. And in the book, I organize our shifting understanding and views of race into a set of 4 paradigms, 4 points in time when our beliefs or assumptions have drastically changed. So I start with a paradigm I call Enlightenment race. This is really when the concept of race as we know it emerged during the early Enlightenment era. European thinkers then began categorizing people into racial hierarchies, often placing themselves at the top. And this pseudoscientific approach justified colonization, slavery, genocide, oppression, everything around the world. And then we move into a paradigm of what I call modern race. And this period came when Charles Darwin and his cousin Francis Galton began dividing humanity by continental origins. And it laid the foundations of eugenics and white supremacy, the dangerous idea that intelligence and human worth are biologically determined and that there was a genetic superiority, a hierarchy that was fixed, and that we could manipulate genes to benefit and harm various social groups. So modern race, I argue, held sway for decades until the post-war period when, reeling from Nazi racial science and the Holocaust in the 50s, the world began turning away from eugenics, obviously not fully, but at this point, UNESCO marshaled the world's top scientists to make a statement on race to challenge the modern race paradigm. And this statement said there were no racial hierarchies and all were equal and must be treated as such, especially under the law. But what it didn't do, however, was refute the link between race and biology. So I call this the UNESCO paradigm in my book because it created a new science of race, one that believed that races were the result of biosocial evolution. So as our genes adapted to various continental environments, that's where you got the biology of race, that component. So by the end of the 20th century, under this new paradigm, this UNESCO paradigm, race-based research took on new forms. The civil rights movement inspired the US government and the medical field to use racial categories to chart inclusion or the lack thereof, and discrimination in science, public health, medicine. Genomics was a new field when all this started to happen. Initially, genome scientists stayed completely out of the debate over the implementation of racial classifications in science, medicine, and public health. But genomics was constantly being elevated to humanity's next big hope, right? And in this struggle to move from bench to bedside, scientists began touting the importance of equitable research. And so genomics, what I call genomic race, became this new paradigm. In genomics, as I have been talking about so far today, research has often presented the outcomes according to the racial taxonomy, the quasi-racial continental population origins, not because researchers believe that that's the right thing to do, but because there are some kind of societal and institutional pressures to do so. One of the most alarming trends that I discuss in the book is how genetics is misused in medicine and technology, where scientists and companies often treat race as if it's a biological fact, leading to misleading medical treatments and policies. For example, the heart medication Bidil was marketed specifically for Black patients only. The terms they used in their communiques were Blacks only, despite there being no clear genetic basis for why it would work better for Black patients versus everybody else. In my book and in my current research, I also explore a technology that has gained traction in recent years called embryo scoring. Today, there are studies that use genetic risk scores to make predictions about intelligence and success and antisocial behavior, right? Those sociogenomic studies, and they're being used with AI-powered software to sort and score embryos. Recall that most sociogenomic research relies on highly racialized data. IQ scores, school statistics, crime rates, all of that, they all have long histories of racial bias. When we train our algorithms on this data, we aren't eliminating the bias, we're encoding it into the future. This new technology will have profound consequences. We are already seeing calls to use genetic data to tailor the education system, again, to identify students at risk based on their genetic profiles, to sort them into special programs, to steer their futures before they've had a chance to define it for themselves. Imagine a future where an algorithm trained on flawed genetic and social data, social science data, determines that certain children, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, are unlikely to succeed in advanced mathematics. So they're redirected into vocational tracks, never given the chance to explore their intellectual potential, their quantitative reasoning. Imagine the impact that would have not just on their individual lives, but on our entire communities, reinforcing these cycles of inequality under the guise of scientific objectivity. And now imagine a future where that same algorithm has already been used to genetically engineer so-called intellectually superior, math-savvy human beings. So those gene-edited kids could gain a systematic advantage from the start of their lives. And we've seen how this plays out in history. It starts with promises of individualized learning and quickly turns into a justification for stratifying society. Arguments that some people are genetically destined for lower achievement and must be handled differently. The moment that we allow decisions to be made on the basis of flawed racial data, we risk reviving the racial hierarchies that science has spent decades trying to dismantle. So it's not just a scientific issue I'm talking about with you today, it's really a moral issue. For centuries, race science has been used to argue that intelligence is biologically determined, that some groups are inherently superior to others. These ideas fueled the eugenics movement, justified segregation, justified Jim Crow, and informed immigration policies that were designed to exclude and expel people, non-European people. Today, they're being repackaged under the guise of genomic research and personalized medicine. It's your DNA, it's your choice. We have to reject this resurgence of genetic determinism. Intelligence is not something that we inherit, like eye color. It's something that's cultivated through access and opportunity and experience. My definition of intelligence is being able to learn from our environments and of being aware of those opportunities to learn. Our intelligence isn't fixed. It's not stagnant. It's not unchanging. Instead, it's understanding that our brains are always growing and developing and that we have the ability to become more intelligent for the entirety of our lives. But if we allow flawed definitions of and ideas of intelligence and ability and race to take root in our genomic science, we will be reinforcing racial inequalities rather than dismantling them. So this redefinition of intelligence is extremely timely as artificial intelligence technologies that are also shaping our understanding of human differences and human abilities and what human beings are truly like is overtaking our social institutions and systems, work, school, the clinic, the street, our homes even, right? AI has been hailed as this kind of either great, big new tool or like something that's neutral and maybe, is just like helps you be more productive. It's something capable of making objective decisions based on data. It can, process more data than we can. But we know that algorithms reflect the biases of the societies that create them. In recent years, AI systems have been found to exhibit racial bias in policing, hiring, lending decisions, and we're still just beginning to understand how AI is biasing school districts and classrooms and admissions processes. And now we're seeing similar biases emerging in genomic research. AI models trained on racialized genetic data risk entrenching the very inequalities they claim to overcome. If we don't intervene, we may soon find ourselves living in a world where AI determines not only our social outcomes, but according to these technologies, our genetic and human worth. The promise of AI is that it's going to help us make sense of complex patterns, but when those patterns are built on centuries of racial injustice, AI doesn't correct them, it actually amplifies them. We have to be vigilant in ensuring that AI is not used to re-legitimize scientific racism under a new name. Ultimately, what's real about race is not just a critique of race science, it's a call to action. And so one of my biggest hopes for the book is that it will help us develop a new way of thinking and talking about race. Science has the potential to illuminate truth, but only if we approach it critically. We need to be vigilant about how race is used in genetics and medicine and policy. And we need to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not just repeated under the guise of scientific progress. We have to demand better of our scientific institutions. And we have to push for research that acknowledges the real effects of race, how race shapes our health, our wealth, our opportunity, without falling into the trap of genetic determinism. And most importantly, we need to acknowledge race as a lived reality. It affects our health outcomes, our education, our job opportunities, and interactions with the criminal justice system, with law enforcement. Denying its existence is not going to solve racism, but understanding how race operates in our society can help us work towards justice. Race isn't a biological truth, but it is a social reality. And because it's a social reality, we do have the power to reshape it. As I say in my book, we must ingrain the term race with a new meaning, one the activists and intellectuals have for so long relied on. We have to replace our false narratives about race with a deeper understanding of the social reality of race by turning to three important sources of knowledge. And that first source is racially oppressed people who, by virtue of their race, routinely experience racism. We need to listen to people's individual experiences, their wisdom, their hopes, their dreams, their desires. We need to spawn strategy from their firsthand knowledge. And we need to elevate their voices in spite of the dominant voices that would have them remain silent. And the second is the social sciences and the humanities. Politics, law, sociology, psychology, anthropology, philosophy, history, the many fields of art and science social science that analyze and explain racial inequality. We have to expose how laws like immigration bans and gerrymandering, redlining, greenlining, all of these things bring about inequality. And we must expose how less explicit policies and customs and tacit habits like things embedded in hiring practices, homeowner incentives, all of that kind of thing do too. And we must publicize the ways that communities and policies that guide them can build inclusive spaces of self-governance and honest systems of representation for all people. And the third source is the life sciences, like philosophy of science is one part of life science and health science. Genomic science, of course, evolutionary biology, epidemiology, environmental studies, all kinds of fields that remain authoritative and sometimes our final word on how our environments are impacting our DNA. Though I've spent a lot of this talk today warning against the disaster caused by allowing genetic or genomic science to kind of rule racial discourse. Many of us work with and within health science, within biomedicine, and we have to use our power to challenge this idea within our own field, in our own sphere of influence, that race is just genetics. We have to correct any false narratives that we see that promote the idea that races are genetically distinct and that racial inequality is inevitably emblazoned in our DNA. But lest we reinforce the notion that only genomic science or something stamped with the words DNA can define race, we really need more socio-politically oriented research that can pair epigenetic research, social epidemiological models, public health models, and things that can show us a deeper, accurate picture, more accurate picture of the relationship between our bodies and our beliefs. How do our policies and our politics structure systems of opportunity in everyday life? How do a lack of resources get underneath our skin, into our cells, and embedded into the very DNA-based control mechanisms that tell our bodies to wither or thrive? In a radical way of approaching race is needed now more than ever. And this will require a radical look at reality, privileging accounts of race and studies of racism that see vast interconnected networks of our various biosocial gene environment systems will allow us to move beyond those limited kind of contemporary approaches that are particularly vulnerable to distortion and racist systematization. Race, the idea and the material thing that it is hitting us on all of these levels of reality. It's too easy for the language of social construct to become non-racist, not anti-racist, and then what are we left with but complicity, otherwise known as more racism. We need explicit language that can wake us up to the real and life-threatening thing that is race. We need to stop calling race a social construct and start calling it a social reality. Perceiving race and seeing race as embedded, structural, and material will illuminate the true meaningfulness of race. For our genetics, which is a fiction that is entirely real and will continue to be so as long as we maintain race as tyranny. But by mobilizing on these fronts and articulating new ways of seeing race, we can move the needle away from DNA lies toward human truth. We can materialize a better reality of race. So I am so excited to continue this conversation with you today and into the future. And as we prepare for our Q&A, and then of course we'll have a nice reception and more wonderful things, I would love for you to connect with me. On this slide are ways you can keep in touch with me after our talk today. I would love for everyone to take a moment right now, if you can, to connect with me if you're on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, whatever your preferred threads, Facebook, whatever you like to do most. If not, please consider checking out my Substack. It's where I share information about my ongoing research, and I share deeper dives into what's real about race. I talk about eugenics. I talk about emerging technologies like embryo scoring, all of that kind of stuff, all the things that I'm really like that are in progress for me. are on that Substack. So thank you so much for being here. And if you can, before we do Q&A, just take a moment to connect with me. Thank you so much.
Right, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so please raise your hand.
Thanks, it was really interesting talk.
Yeah.
So I have sort of a methodological question,
Yeah.
Which is going to sound abstract and boringly philosophical, and then I'll follow it up with something that hopefully is a little bit more useful. So the big question is sort of just what counts as evidence that something is real on your view? It's sort of the big question.
Yeah.
I'll give you a more concrete version, which that So one of the things he said is we should be suspicious of genomic sorts of accounts of race.
Yeah.
Partly because they often invoke racialized data. But I take it if you're a social constructionist, you're going to want to use a lot of social scientific evidence. And I suspect a lot of that is racialized too.
Yeah.
And so why should we feel better when we use racialized data and we're social constructionists rather than biological realists about race?
Yeah. So I think the problem with the way that I've seen genome scientists and sociogenomicists using the data is that instead of saying like, okay, before we input, educational attainment, like say, this person got a PhD and this person, didn't graduate from high school, before we input the data as like, check this or that, a social scientist would say, let's know something more about the social conditions of that person's life. And you would look at, not just like what race they were, check, and that, like what box to check, and then also what, whether they got the PhD or whether they did or didn't get the high school diploma, but rather looking at more factors and building up a sense of what else could be confounding the data. So the problem, as one of my dissertation committee members / big mentors, Troy Duster, said, garbage in, garbage out. So it's like if you just take these things and one of the things that I always thought was really interesting is that sociogenomicists, when I was writing that book, things are a little bit different now, but like they wouldn't use any continuous variables. So it was like very much like, check, check, check. And then now here are the people who share, who we're going to consider to be like the cases, and here are the controls, right? So these are the people we're going to hunt for the like PhD gene in, and this is the population that we're going to hunt for the, prison gene in or whatever, right? So that's the kind of thing. So I think that the way that a social scientist would approach the data is differently, because they would say, we need to know about all of this other stuff before we input this as, genetic loser.
Okay. So it sounds like the kinds of things you're talking about are going to be things like education, income. I guess I'm more interested directly in race, which is like, for social science I've seen, it's still a categorical variable.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a lot of problematic uses of racial categories in social science. So I also take issue with that. I didn't in this talk, but yeah, I take issue with people just using the categories again as like a check, 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 and not seeing like, because there's research out there that's really powerful about how people's racial identities often change over their lifetime. So Aaliyah Saperstein is one of these people. She's at Stanford, Oh, yay, wonderful. Yeah. So, it's like that's the kind of thing where it's like people's, I mentioned the the drug Bidil, and that was the US's first race-based medicine. And there was like someone did revisited the people who were involved in the clinical trial that gained them FDA approval as a race-based medicine. And there were people in the trial who had changed their racial identity from Black to white. So it's like, that's problematic, to be like, oh yeah, so this is like good for Black people, but then people have changed their racial identity. It's not fixed and stable, So I think that even social science research or social research that does that is problematic as well. Yeah, that's a really good point and question. Yeah.
newspaper.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So they could recognize and kind of just
Yeah.
a little bit, but
Mhm.
I'd like to know about, is it just a problem of we're not following having factors in the sense that
Yes.
are already racially segregated in the sense that we already have hierarchies from historical inequality, or is there a kind of sense in which the actual kind of measures we're designing to track are, because you also mentioned IQs, not just that we're using racialized data, but that the way we designed the IQ is looking at things that are favored by
Right.
society or something like that. Is it just
Yeah, it's both. No, it's both. And that's what is so problematic, is that it's like we have the garbage in comes in like early, like upstream and then downstream as well. So it's like, the tests themselves are biased, and then later on the kind of like who clocks in as having high IQ versus average IQ versus low IQ versus, the kind of numerical spread that would be considered in the past feeble-minded or moronic or imbecilic or whatever. It's like all of that is confounded by standard of living, and that is also confounded by race, right? And so it's like, so it's in the early upstream kind of collection of data in the first place, and then also later on. So it's both. And that's why I am now working on a book about AI and AI genomics, and like, different ways that different learning, large language models and different kind of machine learning programs and softwares and, all of that kind of stuff stands to really reinforce all of the biases that are in all of the training data as well, right? So that's like another step along the way, that like then you have data sets that have been made from these other data sets that were made from these other data sets, and there's all of this like all these ways that along the way they've been racialized, and then that's supposed to be just fact, or like tokens, right? So it's like all the tokens that like we can predict. And yeah, there's a really good book about like the harms of predictive software, AI software, called AI snake oil, if some of you are interested in the AI thing, but so it's just like anything that's saying like, okay, well, now we're not just going to predict the next word, but we're going to actually predict your behavior, it's very dangerous because of all of this along the way racialization of the data. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk.
Yeah, you're
I was
welcome.
really curious to hear more about the embryo
Scoring.
scoring.
Yeah.
It seemed to me at least like if there isn't like, like large genetic factors contributing to intelligence, then it's basically like false advertising or getting rich people to waste money.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me actually like that's great. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I can see how the other uses of the educational attainment score with race, right?
Right.
Dealing with like opportunities and sorting, like you can see how that reinforces inequality. But at least the embryo scoring, like I thought it was kind of funny, right? And so is it more that like there's no right like racialized genetic determination of intelligence?
Yeah.
Like kind of what's going on there?
Yeah. So it would be cool if it were just people who deserve to get swindled getting swindled, but it's not that simple, because the people who are funding the startups that are doing this kind of AI genomic magic, they are people like Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel. Like, these are the major funders. And so what happens is they create these company, they like make these companies a reality. They're also creating like these schools that are for their genetically edited or enriched, enhanced. So it's like they're creating new systems of privilege, and not just like systems of like in some like vague way, but like literally like they're pulling a new education system out of a hat, right? Out of their rich hat. And so it's like, if it weren't big players who have the capacity to really mess with our education system and create things that have lasting effects, then it would be fine, you know? But it's like they're the people who are doing this, and they're sponsoring it financially, they're making it, they're breathing reality and life into it, right? So that part is really dangerous, to have the same people who are trying to essentially dismantle public education, you know, creating private schools for their genetically engineered kids because they paid for these companies to be made. And, you know, and then whoever else like is swindled by the companies, they can go to these schools, right? And they can all like make these communes and whatever, they like alternate societies on the Big Island in Hawaii, whatever, you know, they're doing right now, right? So like that's what's happening. And it's dangerous because it's really shifting what education is going to be. And yeah, and also like, what is healthcare going to be if we have these genetic haves? Supposedly we might know that they're not, that there are no haves or have-nots, right? But like they believe that they are, and they have the power to like do damage with that belief, right? Which is that it kind of like brings us back to like the kind of root message of my book, which is that it's a fiction that kills, it's a fiction that harms, right? So it's a lie that will really mess us up, you know? Yeah.
And
Thank you very much. I guess I wanted to know a little bit more detail about the new kind of science we should be doing, because I mean, I can see, and I think, you know, it's clear that, you know, politically, maybe ethically, I agree with the presumption that racial difference is not indicative of intelligence or more other moral categories.
Yeah.
There's data to suggest why we should also think that. But I mean, this is about a kind of science first move as opposed to a political first. How do we do the better science? Are you suggesting we need different ontologies under which we classify and collect data, and then is that being done somewhere, and are the results different than the ones where it's not being done? Can you point to the kind of different way of doing science, other than a different way of understanding the categories that science can be done in?
Yeah, I think that the like most kind of solid and informed area of research that I've seen is people studying the multi-generational, transgenerational effects of racism through epigenetic research. And so that it's hard to measure, but you know, there are studies out there that are looking at I mean, you know, I think that
you mean epigenetic in the post-translational methylation kind of epigenetic?
Yeah, like methylation, and like basically like looking at how, so in the most kind of simplified way of saying it, when our gene regulation systems are compromised by some kind of environmental stressor or some kind of environmental adverse exposure, right? So it's like, I've seen good studies that are trying to measure the effects of like epigenetic signatures that are somehow traceable to enslavement or to Jim Crow or to, you know, so I think that that's a good start, but I don't know how many of those studies have been replicated. So, you know, I don't think that there's a lot for me to point to. I think social epidemiological research is good, and especially research on social weathering is good, you know, so like that's been around for quite a while. And what I mean by that is like the Arlene Geronimus kind of, looking at different populations, people of color who have had different essentially aging trajectories over their lifetime, people aging prematurely and all of that. There's a lot of that out there. So I think that's very helpful. But basically, my big thing is let's measure racism's effect on the body and not just alleles of people who identify as this category versus this category. That's what we have right now is like the majority of studies are doing this kind of like really like this person identified as Black, so we're going to put them in this clinical trial as a Black person, and then we're going to use that as a proxy for their genetics and just assume that they are all people of African descent and, that they're a population, a genetic population. And then we're going to give them this, drug, and then we're going to say, okay, it helped them. And that's why only Black people should take this drug, right? That's really irresponsible. And it's just that thing of like saying, this person said they were this and they're this, and, and then they have these genes, and then, or they have this reaction to this, pharmaceutical therapy or something like that. That's the irresponsible way that is the dominant way right now. So yeah, I think anything that gets us to how racism affects the body. Otherwise, don't use racial categories. That's something I've been like echoing through all of my books and my research is just use racial categories when you're talking about racial discrimination, racism, racial bias. If you're measuring that, then you'll be telling us something that's productive and helpful. If you use them as a proxy for DNA, that's very unhelpful. Yeah, and I have a part of one of the chapters in the book that looks at different alleles that we associate with race and shows how they're completely misleading and basically like part of the lie of race is that like this means that, oh, so you're Black or you're this or that, and like they're not good markers of race in any way or shape or form. Yeah, so I think you'll like that part.
Matt.
So I'm sort of curious about like if Rina ran the world, like how would genomics have worked well? So would you have just said, just sample your DNA, don't put the race label on it at all,
yeah,
and just run genomics without race?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that's what the leaders of the genome projects were telling me way back when, and then 5 years later they were all just like
Like why
yeah.
become the champion of racial stuff?
I think that it's because of the way that it's like at first there was a big movement in the 90s, like late 80s, early 90s in public health and biomedicine to start using racial categories in order to promote inclusion. And genomics was late to the game. So I feel like in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were still like genomics was like, oh, okay, we don't agree with this. This isn't correct, but then by the, late 2000s, late aughts or whatever, however you want to say it, that then scientists were like, we have to use these categories. Like we can't do this research without them. Not only were there mandates in the mid 90s, but also there was a sense of responsibility to make genomics relevant to the general public and to bring it out of the lab. And so I feel like I would love it if people just did not use racial categories unless they were measuring racism. But I've talked to and consulted with genome companies, big companies that like make the mRNA vaccines and all this kind of stuff. And every time I get in the room with pharmaceutical companies or gene testing companies or any of that kind of stuff, the people are always like, but how do you do that? because we're supposed to be serving the people of America and we want to have a diverse you know, and I'm like, yeah, you also can recruit people into your studies and you can recruit people into your clinical trials and then stop using the labels that you use for recruitment. That's an option, right? But that means you have to say to the whole team and the whole company and the whole, you know, you have to say, we're not going to use these in analysis or in reporting, but somehow they keep coming back in the reporting too. So it's like upstream, midstream, downstream, kind of like the same thing, you know. Yeah.
You did mention how, since at least writing your earlier book on sociogenomics, that methods or practices have shifted in certain ways.
Yeah.
I guess I was just curious how somebody who might be an advocate or defender of that approach would respond to some of the ways that you're kind of characterizing their practices or the kinds of conclusions that one might be inclined to draw. Because I mean, I can imagine sort of playing, like, well, no, we're not going to like read race into the data, but we're going to look for genomic markers of ancestry. And
right.
draw conclusions from that, and they're not going to be these strong deterministic conclusions.
Right.
But, you know, just saying, well, look, there's sort of, you know, this level of correlation with this and educational attainment, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Still problems or issues.
No, I think that there's been a shift in sociogenomics away from really problematic kind of social phenomena that they call phenotypes, right? Like a phenotype in the early years would be something like, I literally saw articles on gang banging, you know, which is like a really bad, horrible, racist word in the first place. It just has those connotations. But so like that kind of thing, that was like early years, you know, and then there are researchers today who do research on biosocial phenomena that have a genetic or biological component, like people who are doing research into like fertility, for example. It's like, it's biosocial, right? It's not like gang banging, which is like, that is not a biological thing, right? There's no way that there's a gene for, or like like allele that is associated with gang banging. There are alleles that are associated with the population you're looking in, right? So it's like, that's, if you're studying, if you're getting data from, like, there was a point in 2010 where the California prison system was like, we're going to let you use prisoners' data because we have it, you know? And so like, if you do that, then you're going to get a lot of very racialized outputs, right? So, but yeah, so like fertility, like, so there are a lot of, you know, kind of shifts towards biosocial phenomena that are not just simply social outcomes, right? So I think that that's made a lot of the problems not go away, but like it's a little bit better. But there's still a problem with the fact that the whole field has this practice, which is already, this is something inherited from mainstream genomics, which is to say, we're only going to do research on people of European descent. And we are not going to generalize to people of other races. That is a racializing move. It's also like, and how do you know what the people, like these people who are self-identified as something, gets us back to that whole like racial identities change, and that it's not something that's just, it's not a good proxy for their biology, right? So I think that kind of thing where you say, these are just for Europeans only, that becomes like almost like a whites only message, right? And so I think that is a problem that will continue to plague the field, but it's also something that plagues the wider field of genomics. Whenever researchers are like, we're doing this versus these people versus these other people. 1000 Genomes Project was like that. It was like basically collecting DNA from people all over the world and then putting it into these like data sets that were little race-based collections, you know, that was really problematic. They shouldn't have done that, you know, like they could have just left it like a big pool of data. And I've had people in like who were at the helm of 1,000 genomes and at the helm of, you know, the Human Genome Project and whatever, like saying, you know, actually at heart, I'm a zoologist. And if I were doing this zoologically, I would just like, you know, grid sample. And then I would just, everything would be pooled, right? Like I wouldn't like say, I know what this person called themselves and like roll that into my data analysis, right? So it's like, I think that there's, we could do better just in general when we talk about race in the any kind of way associated with genetics. We could do better about not doing it unless you're measuring racism. And that includes setting up populations as European, as if there's no admixture in that population, and as if you know for sure that there's no admixture in these other groups, right? Because it really does send the message that like Europeans have their own DNA and Africans have their other thing going on, and Asians, you know, and on and on. So,
If I can.
yeah.
I wonder, could you elaborate a little more on the move, like, or I don't know if this is common practice, but
yeah,
I know there are kind of like ancestral reference populations that are used sometimes. That
yeah.
Sort of, and some researchers sort of claim like this is like kind of something other than race that
Yeah.
we're referring to when we're talking about sort of being able to take somebody's, you know, data and then kind of say, well, it's so similar to these different ancestral reference populations.
Yeah.
So that's what we're talking about, not race.
Yeah, and
What do you
that's
think of that?
totally fine. And that's the part of the book that I was recommending earlier is where I talk about like haplogroups. So it's like there are really what I call finer resolution groupings in like it's hard to call anybody a genetic population anymore. But if you want to say like, oh, like this haplogroup 1A, whatever, or like 25Z or whatever, right? It's like that has no resonance or reference to continental groupings. Population geneticists don't have any use for a continental, you know, apportionment of genetic variation, right? So it's like if we just stick to things, especially like letters and numbers or something, or you know, anything that doesn't sound like Africa, Europe, you know, like that, then we're actually dealing with measurable biological differences, right? So and even like a population, like populations who live in around the Himalayas, for example, they can have very different kind of medical concerns and patterns, right? Patterns. And also the other thing that reminds me of something that I want to say is that I think that it's important for us to move away from just talking about differences as like whatever people superficially have going on and to talk about what's medically relevant. So it's like we can search for, and that's where it's actually been a problem with sociogenomics, because a lot of times people say like, well, this is medically relevant, you know, educational attainment is medically relevant, IQ, intelligence is medically relevant because, you know, people who have low IQ are at higher risk for different kinds of diseases and stuff like that. But anyways, I think that we should be focusing on things that are medically concerning and not just, you know, trying to put people into groups based on superficial, you know, conditions or superficial factors. Yeah.
Sorry, did someone have a question?
No, go ahead.
I want to pick your brain
Yeah.
a little bit about how you're understanding social construction. So
Yeah.
here's sort of a first sketch of how I understand social constructionism.
Yeah.
About anything. which is you sort of represent a group of people in a particular way.
Mhm.
That representation can be accurate or inaccurate, except there are concrete social consequences of some significant threshold.
Yeah.
That's what makes it real.
Right, right. Yeah.
You focus a lot on bad social consequences
Right.
of being represented as a member of a racial group.
Yeah.
And there certainly are those.
Yeah.
But you only mention those. And
Yeah.
there's a long tradition going back at least to Du Bois of also saying, hey,
Yeah.
there's some good things about
Right.
represented.
Right.
Being racialized essentially.
Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering how that fits into the story because it's just not
Yeah.
in the story.
So it's not in the story because I had a chapter that was about social movements and about, racial advocacy and about all of the kind of good that has come out of people organizing around shared experiences, lived experiences. So around the social construction of race, and yeah, creating new social constructions that are alternatives to the bad ones in a way. But my editors didn't want that chapter in there. They were like, other people do that, and you're the genetics genomics person. So yeah, so that's why it's not in the talk, But yeah, I think it's really important, and I wanted it to be in there, And yeah, I got like there are other people who do that kind of thing. But that's why I say it's my last like point of that I make is really like, let's manifest a better reality, because I'm not like, oh yeah, it's going to go away, right? It's like, we just need to do a better job. We got to improve the reality that we're creating, that we're constructing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So my question is about very distant future. So I appreciate
Yeah.
that. But I'm interested in your thing.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that in recent decades or years, because of migration, globalization, and so on, have an increasing percentage of children being born to very mixed backgrounds.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you think that in the perspective of, I don't know, like 10, 20 generations, the category of race will entirely cease to exist. And if you think that it will,
Mm-hmm.
what does it mean for your definition as race, as social reality? How
Yeah.
does reality cease to exist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I do think that we are always moving towards more mixing and more, people moving all around the globe, as you said. And I think that what is surprising is that a lot of the scientists that I interviewed for and spent time with for Race Decoded, my first book, which was my dissertation for all the grad students who weren't at lunch, So hang on, you're almost there, But yeah, it's a lot of those researchers that I spoke with had mixed families. Either they themselves were mixed, or they had children who were mixed, or they're basically they were a part of mixed families. And so for them, they were like so hopeful that we could get away from the racial categories. But again, they were the same people who were publishing using these quasi-continental categories, quasi-racial categories, or continental categories. And so I think that there could be a world in which everybody is mixed and we still use these categories as the original populations. And it's irresponsible, given that we know that there are finer resolution categories that we have at our disposal, and that if we're really looking for medically relevant kind of phenomena, we're going to find that those categories are going to be more helpful to us, right? Because if you just say like, well, everybody from Africa has the same risk for sickle cell disease, that's just not true. That's incorrect, right? So it's like you're going to have problems if you approach it that way. Or if you say everybody in Europe, they all have a higher risk for cystic fibrosis or something like that. And that's just not true either. So it's like, I could see us being a bunch of, mixed race families and mixed race researchers and people still using these old categories. I hope that's not the case, but I don't know. I don't know where we're going, The one thing I do know is that there's a lot of money behind AI genomics right now. So I'm like, that part I feel pretty certain is going to come to fruition, that we will have more AI embedded in our healthcare and in and like utilizing genetic data, personal genetic data. And I was thinking about writing my next Substack, because I write it's kind of like an op-ed every month, you know. And I was thinking about writing about like how we need a new Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act, or, you know, GINA, for like the AI genomic era, because it's like, you know, who knows where that's going to take us, you know. This is a little bit far away from what you initially asked, but yeah, I do feel like there's some things we can predict kind of, but then there are other things I'm not so sure about. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, these racial patterns are specific outside of the United States.
Yes, yeah, it's true.
Rural,
Yeah.
France, Europe,
Right.
and social science, national science as well. So typically they use some different sort of categories, like doctors, like anthropology, like are they sort of the outside the internal science?
Mm-hmm.
And do you, I mean, do you suggest some, so for example, for sickle cell disease,
Yeah.
now we are screening all of the, like only kids from parents who had a background of West Africa or Africa,
Mm-hmm.
some disease.
Yeah.
So sort of ethnic origin is used as a conscious factor.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, do you think in that, for example, case, it's not a case where the sort of distinctions are used for talking about racism,
Mm-hmm. but
what sort of categories should be used there? Do you think like that sort of system is good? It's sort of connected to some sort of other demographic categories, like
yeah. Yeah, I think that ethnic origin is way better than using racial categories, but even better are to drill down to even finer resolution, which like there's these researchers, Tim Rebick and Pamela Sankar, have written about like the difference between major ethnicity and minor ethnicity. And so like even, you know, sometimes the way, so like I'll tell you, like Google and 23andMe, the categories that like the way that they talk about race is called major ethnicities. And so their data sets are racialized, but like on the back end, no one would know that, like, you know, but anyways, they call ethnicities like the continental groups, right? And so there are ways that like there are slippages with the word ethnicity anyways, but talking about like West African, it's like to be even more specific than West African or Central African. That's a lot of different groups, right? So I think that there are ways to use demographic categories and to do public health with them that could get us closer to those haplogroupings and might be more useful in that sense. But like to have even West African and Central African, to me, leaves a lot to be desired, because it's just like a region, you know, it's like two regions of Africa. Where it gets really problematic is when people say sub-Saharan Africa, right? That's always like, you know, a bad category to me. But getting into more minor ethnicity. So for example, I think that one of their examples in this paper that I'm referring to, and I think it was a paper about Medline, so you can look that up, is like Ashkenazi Jewish would be more minor than Jewish, right? So just trying to drill down to the finest resolution that you can come up with. And even that is kind of like a broad category too, right? But like anything that you can get closer to actual genetic groupings that population geneticists who use the finest kind of form of genetic grouping, that's better than, you know, and so like, yeah, if the government wants to target a demographic group, maybe they want to target Senegalese, or maybe they want to target Congolese or something like that, you know, then even within those countries, there are more minor ethnic groups. So like figuring out what are the populations that actually have higher rates of this? Not just testing everybody who is an immigrant or is from Africa or from like the north half of sub-Saharan Africa or something, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
So I completely agree that there's a bunch of articles we actually teach on them that, you know, race is the worst medical proxy available to us, right? And we rate.
Yeah.
We had like what we really want, which is like, you know, what is your genetic medical condition?
Yeah.
So doesn't that sort of push us toward this sort of absolute personal genomics? Like
Yeah.
Francis Collins' All of Us program.
Yeah.
And doesn't that lead us right back to sort of genetic determinist program?
Yeah.
Don't want.
It could. That's a good question. It could, you know, it does. Yeah. It has like, it screams like, you know, here's your gene chip, you know, or whatever. People like Robert Plomin would say like, oh, you just have your gene chip and then we'll sort you into different schools, or, you know, not send you to school. We'll send you to the labor camp or something, you know, it's like super dangerous. Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have I shouldn't be in charge, I guess, right? Like I shouldn't be ruling the world. Yeah.
Question about the history and the role of scientists during the genomic project and the attitude toward race.
Yeah.
You're somewhat simplifying a little bit scientist attitude. Because there were many scientists that took the genomic data.
Yeah.
It's also more important the use of software like structure,
Yeah.
clusters, the genomic data.
Yeah.
It shows that you can actually recover continental population as a way of arguing that actually race is biologically real.
Yeah.
Bill Wish.
Yeah.
Dozens of
You're right.
thousands in like Nature and Science arguing that actually genomics shows that race is a biological category,
Yeah.
useful for biological sciences. At the same time, intellectuals like Pinker and Wade, so like slightly outside
right.
science, but
Yeah.
you know, at the intersection of science and the public,
Yeah.
to work, that kind of work, to argue that race is biologically real. So it's not
Yeah.
actually nice scientists who totally socialize.
No, it's true.
The institution. Many scientists actually contributed.
You're right.
To refining again.
Yeah.
The picture is
I
actually
know.
somewhat less
Yeah.
right that you're describing. I think scientists are actually responsible for biological verification of race that we saw happening in the 2000s, not in 2010.
Yeah. No.
And where this
It's
is a
true.
consequence of this 15 years of talking about race in a genomic context. So,
Yeah. No, it's true. And some of the people that I spoke to who are kind of like, you know, I think that, yeah, it's a bad bad proxy for genetics, and yeah, I wouldn't use it. Subsequently went on to write books or write things like David Reich was one of the people that I spoke to who was kind of like, you know, it's not a good, it's too rough. Like we don't need that, you know? And then later on wrote a book that was basically like, yeah, actually there are like good uses for using race, and that there's some truth to that there are differences between racial groups, you know? And so yeah, people, you know, you're right, it was not all pretty. And there were people that I spoke with who were very adamant about using racial categories, not just for recruitment, but for reporting, you know. And Esteban Burchard is one of the people who is just like, no, and he's mixed. And he talked about like his experiences, like seeing the racism that his mom faced. And, so it's like people, yeah, they interpret their experiences of race in such varied ways. And some people were like, really like, I am a person of color, or I'm queer, or I have a reason why I need to like make sure that people respect these categories and maintain them, and don't just like whitewash and colorblind that our whole science, so.
During COVID testing, when the first large test of the main vaccines actually didn't have very many people coming from a minority background.
Right.
In fact, there were very few African Americans in some of the tests, and people of color, many of them actually thought I was scandalous. I think from biological point of view, probably were wrong about that. They were doing the stats, but but I think there was a very strong reaction to that, actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's like inclusion always is like this thing that kind of muddies the water in a way, because it's like we do need inclusion, but then we also need to know when to call it quits with the categories and not just transfer them to every single part of the research and reporting process. But again, like when I talk to pharmaceutical companies or, other people in industry, how like for them, they're like, but like, how are we going to communicate it to the general public if we don't use the racial categories? Because that's what they're used to hearing. And, we're trying to like reach all of these people. And it's like, it's very bad reason to geneticize race,
Any other question? Q&A?
Yeah, we can move it to the reception.
All right.
Yeah.
Before we start, we have a reception.
Yeah.
On the 11th floor, so you're all invited to join us. There's also some books.
Yeah.
Signing. And so thanks again for this wonderful
Yeah,
talk.
thank you.
For the Q&A.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
So join us on to the 11th floor.
Thanks so much.